The train rattled beneath them, its iron wheels clacking against the rails with a rhythm that had become almost hypnotic over the past 3 days. Ernst Mueller pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching as the vast American landscape rolled past, endless fields now dusted with the first snow of December. The year was 1943, and like hundreds of other German prisoners of war, Ernst had been captured in North Africa, processed through temporary camps in England, and now found himself being transported deep into the American heartland. As the train slowed, he caught his first glimpse of what would become his home for the remainder of the war, Camp Algona, Iowa, its wooden barracks and guard towers rising like strange islands amid a sea of white. The prisoners shuffled from the train, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Rumors had circulated throughout their journey, whispers of harsh treatment, forced labor, even summary execution. Their officers had told them that Americans were savages, undisciplined and cruel, especially to captured enemies. Ernst clutched his few belongings closer, bracing himself for whatever awaited beyond the camp gates. The guards, rifles slung over their shoulders, directed them forward with gestures and occasional words of broken German. Their faces revealed neither hatred nor sympathy, just the weary efficiency of men performing a duty. "They will break us now," muttered Hans Richter, a weathered sergeant who had fought at Tobruk. "This is where the real punishment begins." But as they passed through the gates, what awaited them was neither violence nor deprivation. Instead, they were greeted by the smell of hot food wafting from a large mess hall. Each man was processed efficiently, photographed, documented, assigned a bunk in barracks that, while simple, were clean and heated against the Midwestern winter. Ernst stood in stunned silence as an American quartermaster handed him 2 wool blankets, a change of clothes, soap, and a small book of camp regulations translated into German. "This cannot be real," whispered Franz Weber, a young private from Munich. "They must be preparing us for something worse." Later, as Ernst sat on his assigned bunk, running his fingers over the thick fabric of the blankets, a guard passed through announcing dinner in the mess hall. The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. Was this some elaborate American trick? A method of psychological warfare, perhaps? What lay beyond these first hours of captivity? And how long would this strange civility last before revealing its true nature? As night fell over Camp Algona, Ernst and his fellow prisoners lay awake, warm despite the howling wind outside, wondering what possible purpose the Americans could have for treating their enemies with such unexpected humanity. The morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Ernst and his fellow prisoners lined up outside the mess hall. The smell of coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz blend of roasted grains they had grown accustomed to in the last years of rationing in Germany, drifted through the air. Inside, the hall buzzed with the clatter of trays and the low murmur of conversation. American guards stood at intervals, watchful but relaxed, some even nodding as the Germans filed past. Breakfast consisted of eggs, bacon, toast with butter, and steaming mugs of coffee with real sugar. Ernst stared at his tray, remembering the thin gruel that had become standard fare for German soldiers in the North African campaign. Even before that, civilian rations in Germany had dwindled to pathetic portions as the war progressed. His mother's last letter, received months ago, had mentioned that she saved her weekly egg ration to make a single small cake for his father's birthday. "This is more food than I've seen in 2 years, said Otto Braun, a corporal from Hamburg, his voice barely above a whisper. "My children at home eat less than this in a day." The abundance wasn't limited to food. The barracks, while sparse, had solid walls and heating systems that kept the winter chill at bay. Hot water flowed from the shower buildings. There were medical facilities where actual doctors examined new arrivals for illness or injury. American officers, through interpreters, that, according to the Geneva Convention, prisoners would be treated humanely and could even earn a small wage by working in nearby farms or factories. For men who had been told that capture meant torture or death, each revelation came as a shock. Ernst's unit had been instructed to fight to the death rather than surrender, their commander insisting that Americans took no prisoners. Yet here they sat, eating eggs while snow fell gently outside the windows. The Americans seemed almost casual in their abundance. Guards tossed half-smoked cigarettes into bins, where desperate European refugees would have treasured every scrap of tobacco. In the infirmary, a medic unwrapped fresh bandages from sealed packages, using them liberally on even minor wounds. One guard, noticing Ernst's worn-out boots, simply pointed him to the supply room where he was issued a new pair without question. "They treat us better than our own army," muttered Hans, examining his new boots with disbelief. Why would they waste such resources on enemies? Some prisoners suspected it was all for show. Perhaps international observers were coming, or maybe this was an elaborate propaganda effort. Others feared it was psychological manipulation, designed to break their loyalty by contrasting American abundance with German austerity. The truth, as Ernst would gradually discover, was both simpler and more profound. America's vast industrial and agricultural capacity meant that feeding, housing, and clothing prisoners required just a tiny fraction of the nation's output. What seemed like extraordinary luxury to the Germans was merely standard procedure to the Americans. As December deepened, whispers began to circulate through the camp. The Americans were apparently planning something for Christmas. Prisoners exchanged skeptical glances. Surely this would be when the facade cracked, when their captors would mock the defeated Germans with some parody of their sacred holiday. What strange humiliation awaited them, and how would they maintain their dignity when faced with whatever crude American spectacle was being prepared? The first sign came 3 weeks before Christmas, when the camp commander assembled the prisoners and announced that they would be allowed to form a choir and prepare traditional German carols. Ernst, who had sung in his church choir in Dusseldorf before the war, found himself volunteered by fellow prisoners who remembered his fine tenor voice. Rehearsals would be held in the mess hall after dinner, supervised but not interfered with. The Germans exchanged confused glances. Was this some elaborate joke? That evening, 30 men gathered hesitantly in the corner of the mess hall. A young American lieutenant who spoke passable German explained that they could select their own songs, within reason, and that materials would be provided for any decorations or simple instruments they wished to construct. The prisoners stood in awkward silence until Otto, the corporal from Hamburg, began to hum Stille Nacht. Others joined, voices initially wavering, then growing stronger as the familiar melody filled the space. For Ernst, the sound unlocked something he had kept carefully sealed away. Memories of Christmas before the war, his mother at the piano, his father's deep laugh, the smell of pine and spiced wine. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, and for a moment he wasn't a prisoner thousands of miles from home. He was simply a man remembering beauty in a world that had shown him too much ugliness. When they finished, there was silence. Even the American guards seemed affected. Their usual professional detachment momentarily cracked. One older guard, gray-haired and weathered, nodded slightly, something like recognition in his eyes. "Again," said the lieutenant softly, and they sang once more. In the days that followed, something shifted in the camp. The choir grew to 60 voices. The Americans provided materials, paper, paint, scraps of wood, and the prisoners began crafting decorations. Men who had been engineers in civilian life designed small carved figures. Others fashioned paper stars and chains. The barracks gradually transformed, small touches of home appearing in this strange place. Ernst found himself looking forward to rehearsals, to the moments when the war receded and only music remained. But questions lingered beneath the surface. Why would their captors encourage this? What possible advantage could Americans gain by allowing German prisoners to celebrate their traditions? And, most troubling of all, how could Ernst reconcile his growing comfort with the knowledge that somewhere, thousands of miles away, his real family would face a bleak Christmas with little food and the constant threat of Allied bombing? As Christmas approached, the camp buzzed with preparations, and Ernst struggled with a growing sense that what was happening here was not merely unexpected. It was something that would challenge everything he had been taught about America, about war, and about the very nature of enemies. "We have a tradition at home," Carl Schmidt said, carefully cutting a pattern into a piece of tin salvaged from the kitchen. The former schoolteacher from Dresden had revealed himself to be surprisingly skilled with his hands. My father would hide a pickle ornament in our Christmas tree, and whoever found it first on Christmas morning would have good fortune for the year. Ernst watched as Karl worked, transforming the discarded metal into an intricate ornament. Around them, the recreation hall had become a workshop of sorts. Dozens of prisoners bent over tables, crafting decorations from whatever materials the Americans had provided. Paper, wood scraps, bits of metal, even the colored foil from cigarette packages. The guards watched with curious interest, occasionally asking questions through the interpreters. My mother made straw stars, offered Friedrich Lange, a young private who had been a farmer before the war. His fingers, once calloused from plowing fields, now delicately twisted pieces of straw into complex patterns. She said they represented the Star of Bethlehem, bringing light even in the darkest winter. These conversations had become commonplace as December progressed. Memories of home shared in hushed voices, descriptions of traditions and celebrations from lives that now seemed to belong to different men entirely. Ernst found himself speaking of his family's Christmas Eve rituals, the midnight church service, his father reading the nativity story, the small gifts exchanged, more as tokens of love than displays of wealth. What surprised him most was how the American guards listened. One sergeant named Collins had mentioned that his grandmother came from Bavaria, and he recognized some of the traditions. Another guard shared that his family, too, hid a pickle ornament on their tree, a custom apparently brought to America by German immigrants generations earlier. "They're not so different from us," Ernst thought with a jolt, immediately ashamed of the sentiment. These men were his captors, representatives of a nation bombing German cities where his family still lived. And yet, here was Collins, helping Karl bend a piece of wire for his ornament, explaining in halting German how his own family celebrated Christmas. The camp commander, Major Richards, had authorized a special Christmas dinner and allowed the prisoners to transform the mess hall with their handcrafted decorations. A small pine tree had been brought in, nothing like the grand Tannenbaums of German tradition, but still fragrant with the smell of forest that transported men instantly back to childhood memories. As Ernst helped hang paper chains from the ceiling beams, he caught sight of a calendar someone had tacked to the wall, December 23rd. In 2 days, it would be Christmas, and for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to fully feel the ache of separation from home. Would his family gather this year? Was their apartment in Dusseldorf still standing? The letters he received through the Red Cross were months old and heavily censored. "Mueller," called one of the guards. "Major wants to see you." Ernst followed the guard across the snowy compound to the administration building, anxiety building with each step. Had something been discovered about his past, his unit's actions? Was the Christmas preparation about to be revealed as the elaborate pretense he had initially suspected? Instead, Major Richards sat at his desk with an interpreter beside him and what appeared to be a choir program in his hands. "Corporal Mueller," he said, the interpreter translating efficiently, "I understand you're leading the Christmas choir." Ernst nodded stiffly. "We have a small church in town, and the pastor has asked if some of your men might be willing to sing during their Christmas Eve service tomorrow night. Strictly voluntary, of course. You would be under guard, but the townspeople thought it might be appropriate. Many of them are of German descent." Ernst stared in disbelief. They were being invited to sing, not just for themselves, but for American civilians? To enter a town? A church? "Why?" he asked finally. The major seemed to consider the question carefully. "It's Christmas, Corporal. Even in war, some things remain sacred." As Ernst walked back to his barracks, snow crunching beneath his boots, his mind raced with implications. The Americans weren't just allowing them to observe Christmas, they were inviting them to participate in a community celebration. The boundary between prisoner and captor, enemy and friend, seemed suddenly less absolute than he had been taught. That night, as he discussed the invitation with the other choir members, opinions were sharply divided. Some saw it as an opportunity to escape the confines of the camp, if only for a few hours. Others worried it was a propaganda exercise, that they would be paraded as defeated specimens. A few suspected a trap of some kind. "We should refuse," insisted Hans, the sergeant from Tobruk. "We are German soldiers, not performing monkeys for American entertainment." "But we would be singing our own songs in a church," countered Friedrich. "What could be more dignified than that?" As the debate continued into the night, Ernst found himself torn between suspicion and an unexpected yearning to experience Christmas beyond the barbed wire, to sit in a proper church rather than a converted mess hall. What would it mean to sing the carols of his homeland for people whose sons were fighting against his comrades? And why did the prospect fill him not with dread, but with a strange sense of purpose? As 24 of them boarded the army truck the next evening, dressed in their cleanest uniforms, Ernst realized they were about to cross a threshold that had nothing to do with the physical boundary of the camp. They were stepping into an experience that would force them to see their captors, and perhaps themselves, in an entirely new light. The small clapboard church glowed with warm light as the truck pulled up, snowflakes swirling in the December darkness. 2 guards accompanied the prisoners inside, their presence more formality than force. The church was packed with townspeople who turned to stare as the German soldiers filed in. Ernst felt a moment of panic. Would there be hostility, heckling, perhaps even violence? Instead, Pastor Miller, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, greeted them at the door with a simple "Willkommen" in accented German. The congregation watched curiously, but not unkindly, as the prisoners were led to a space at the front of the church. "Many of our families came from Germany 3 generations ago," the pastor explained through an interpreter. "We still sing Stille Nacht on Christmas Eve, just as our grandparents did." The service proceeded with readings and prayers in English, but when the time came for music, Ernst stepped forward with his fellow prisoners. Their voices rose hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as they sang the carols of their homeland, O Tannenbaum, Es ist ein Ros entsprungen, and finally, Stille Nacht. As the familiar melody filled the small church, Ernst noticed something extraordinary. The Americans were singing along, their voices joining with the German words they still remembered from their immigrant ancestors. The boundaries seemed to dissolve in that moment. They were not prisoners and townsfolk, enemies separated by war, but simply people united in a ceremony older and perhaps more meaningful than the conflicts that divided them. Ernst saw tears on the faces of both Germans and Americans. An elderly woman in the front row sang with her eyes closed, her pronunciation perfect, obviously remembering the German of her childhood. A middle-aged man who wore an American Legion pin on his lapel, surely a veteran of the previous war against Germany, sang with a solemn dignity that transcended the political divide. After the service, the congregation invited the prisoners to share refreshments in the church hall. There was coffee, real coffee, and homemade cookies, some clearly made from traditional German recipes. Townspeople approached cautiously at first, then with increasing warmth, many attempting phrases in rusty German. "My grandfather came from Dresden," said one woman, offering Ernst a cookie. "He would have been happy to hear these songs again." "My boy is in Europe now," an older man told Friedrich. "Fighting over there. I pray he's being treated well if he's captured." Ernst struggled to reconcile these friendly people with the enemies he had been taught to hate and fear. Here was Mrs. Schmidt, whose son was a pilot in the Pacific, sharing her precious sugar ration to bake Pfeffernüsse for German prisoners. Here was Mr. Weber, who had fought Germans in the First World War, now shaking hands with young men who could have been his enemies just months earlier. As they prepared to return to camp, Pastor Miller presented them with a small gift, a handwritten copy of Stille Nacht for each man, and a promise that the church would remember them in prayer on Christmas Day. On the truck ride back to Camp Algona, the prisoners sat in reflective silence. The experience had shaken something fundamental in their understanding of the war, of America, of what it meant to be an enemy. "They treated us like men, not prisoners," Friedrich said finally. "It's a trick," Hans insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "They want to weaken our resolve, make us forget our duty." Ernst said nothing, but he held the handwritten carol in his pocket, feeling its weight like a stone of truth amid the shifting sands of wartime certainties.
How could these people be the faceless enemies he had been trained to fight? And if he had been wrong about them, what else might he have been wrong about? Back at camp, as Christmas Eve turned into Christmas morning, Ernst lay awake, wondering what his family was doing at that exact moment, and whether they could possibly imagine their son singing German carols in an American church, thousands of miles from the front lines where he was supposed to be fighting or dying for the fatherland. Christmas morning at Camp Algona dawned clear and cold, sunlight glinting off fresh snow.
Ernst woke to the sound of excited voices. His fellow prisoners were already gathered at the windows, pointing toward the compound. Outside, American guards were unloading trucks filled with small parcels wrapped in brown paper. Tables had been set up in the snow, and what appeared to be a Christmas tree, larger than the one in the mess hall, stood in the center of the compound. "What are they doing?" asked Otto, breath fogging the glass. Nobody had an answer, but within the hour they were summoned outside. Major Richards stood beside the tree, which had been decorated with the handcrafted ornaments the prisoners had made over the past weeks. Paper stars, tin figures, even Carl's pickle ornament hung prominently among the branches.
"Gentlemen," the major began, as the interpreter translated, "it is Christmas Day, and while we cannot send you home to your families, we can at least ensure that the day is observed with the dignity it deserves." He gestured to the parcels, explaining that each prisoner would receive a small package from the Red Cross containing basic necessities, cigarettes, and a few modest luxuries. Additionally, the camp had organized a special Christmas dinner, and afterwards there would be a concert featuring both the prisoners' choir and a group of local musicians from town. "We are still enemies in a terrible war," the major concluded, his expression serious, "but today, at least, we can remember our common humanity." The parcels were distributed. Soap, toothpaste, socks, chocolate, cigarettes, a small notebook, and, surprisingly, a Christmas card signed by the camp staff. Ernst turned the card over in his hands, reading the simple message, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." The mess hall had been transformed overnight. The prisoners' decorations hung from every available surface: paper chains, tin stars, carved figures. Tables were set with actual tablecloths, likely borrowed from the officers' quarters. The smell of roasting meat, potatoes, and something sweet filled the air. Dinner was served by the regular kitchen staff, but supervised by Sergeant Collins, who had apparently volunteered for Christmas duty. The meal included roast turkey, mashed potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, and, most incredibly, traditional German dishes: sauerbraten, red cabbage, and a reasonable approximation of stollen for dessert. "My grandmother's recipes," Collins explained when Ernst expressed surprise at the German offerings. "She came from Munich in 1902. After dinner, the promised concert began. The prisoners' choir performed first, singing the same carols they had shared at the church the night before. Then, to their astonishment, a string quartet from the nearby town played selections of German classical music: Bach, Beethoven, Wagner. The music filled the mess hall, transporting the listeners beyond the confines of barbed wire and prisoner status. Hans, the hardened sergeant who had maintained his suspicion throughout the preparations, sat with tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face as the quartet played a piece his father had loved. "It's as if they know us," he whispered to Ernst. "How can they know us this way?" The day's final surprise came after the concert, when Major Richards announced that the prisoners could use the camp's limited radio facilities to broadcast a short Christmas greeting to Germany. Only a few words, carefully monitored, but still, a chance to reach across the ocean, to let families know they were alive, well treated, thinking of home. Ernst stepped up to the microphone when his turn came, heart pounding. What could he possibly say in the few seconds allotted? How could he compress all he had experienced, all he had come to question? "Frohe Weihnachten from Iowa," he said finally. "I am well. The Americans," he paused, searching for words that would pass both censorship and his own conflicted feelings. They remember that we are men, not just soldiers. I think of you every day. As he stepped away from the microphone, Ernst caught Major Richards watching him with an unreadable expression. The American officer nodded once, a gesture that somehow acknowledged the complexity of what was happening. Enemies sharing a moment of peace, each reminded of the other's humanity through the simple observance of tradition.
That night, as the camp settled into silence, Ernst stood at the window of his barracks, looking out at the star-filled sky. The same stars shone over Germany, over his family's home, over the battlefields where his comrades still fought and died. For the first time since his capture, he felt not the burning shame of surrender, but something more complicated, a realization that the lines drawn between nations, between right and wrong, between enemy and friend, were perhaps not as clear as he had once believed. What did it mean that his captors had treated Christmas with such respect? That American families with German roots still sang the songs of their ancestors? That a guard whose own son might be fighting in Europe had worked to ensure prisoners had a taste of home?
These questions had no easy answers. But as Ernst finally turned from the window, he knew that whatever happened in the remaining years of the war, he would never again be able to see Americans as faceless enemies, as the barbaric creatures painted by propaganda. They had revealed themselves as people, complex, contradictory, capable of both waging war and extending unexpected kindness. 5 months later, as spring transformed the Iowa landscape, news reached Camp Algona of Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender. The prisoners gathered in stunned silence as Major Richards confirmed what many had already suspected. The Third Reich had fallen. The war in Europe was over. "What happens to us now?" Friedrich asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. In the coming months, they would learn of their eventual repatriation, of the division of their homeland, of the shocking extent of Nazi atrocities revealed at places like Dachau and Auschwitz.
Many, including Ernst, would return to a Germany unrecognizable from the one they had left, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, the old certainties shattered beyond repair. But amidst the chaos and painful reconstruction of post-war life, Ernst would keep one memento from his time in America, the handwritten copy of Stille Nacht, given to him by Pastor Miller. It would remain with him through the difficult years of rebuilding, a reminder not of captivity, but of an unexpected moment of peace in the midst of war. Decades later, when asked by his grandchildren about his wartime experiences, Ernst would speak not of battles or hardship, but of Christmas 1943 in Camp Algona, of carols sung in an American church, of decorations crafted by homesick men, of the strange discovery that humanity could survive even the darkest winter of conflict. In war, they teach you that the enemy is not like you, he would tell them. But sometimes, across the divide of battle, you catch a glimpse of yourself in the other, and in that recognition lies the first fragile possibility of peace. In the quiet corners of human experience, even amid the thundering chaos of global war, such moments of connection remain, waiting to be discovered, to be remembered, to remind us that beneath the artificial boundaries we create between nations and peoples, there beats a common pulse of humanity. Perhaps in exploring these hidden histories, these unexpected instances of grace amid conflict, we might find not just lessons about the past, but guidance for a future still shadowed by division and misunderstanding.